Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this evening's program. It's certainly going to be a humdinger of an event for sure. Vinay Sitapati is in conversation with Manish Sabharwal this evening, and I must first thank Vinay for readily agreeing to do this. I guess a bit of our National Law School connection made that happen, and thanks Vinay for doing this. And thank you to Manish for readily agreeing to be in conversation with Vinay. Just before I hand over to you, Vinay, ladies and gentlemen, actually, we're now at the cusp. 25 years in a few months will be the 25th anniversary of the first Vajpayee government in 1996, and coming at the end, well, 30th anniversary of the events of 91 as well, which Vinay has covered in his first book. So I guess while the former has had Vinay's insights already, this book is truly a wonderful new addition. And we look forward to the discussion this evening about the events that perhaps led to 96, and then all of that which came before and immediately after between the two men, Jugalbandi, of which this book is all about. Just a couple of housekeeping points before I hand over. The biographies of today's discussants will be in the chat box. Please feel free to write in your questions in the Q&A box. And let's have a great session. Over to you, Vinay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So we're going to give Vinay 5-6 minutes in the beginning to set the context, give us a sense of the book, and then we will jump straight into discussions. And then please feel free to pop your questions into the Q&A box, and we'll obviously leave enough time for them based on how many they are. All yours, Vinay.
Well, first up, thank you for coming for this event. I like to consider myself a Bangalore boy because I spent 5 years in National Law School, Bangalore. I was a junior of Siddharth, and I had an absolutely great time. So it does feel nice to, hopefully you guys will invite me after this once again for a physical meeting, but thank you very much to be sort of electronically present in Bangalore. So very quickly, this is my second book, Jugalbandi, the Bjp before Modi. I wrote a book before this on Narasimha Rao. That was more of a conventional biography. This is both a story of a relationship between two men, but the background of which is the rise of the Bjp before Modi. And the core argument is that, look, to understand Narendra Modi, you have to understand the 100 years that preceded him. That so much of what he does from 370, Article 370 through Citizenship Amendment Act, whether you like it or not, these are long thought through ideas that we just haven't been noticing. And since the Bjp is likely to be the principal pole on which politics oscillates for the next 10 years or so, we should know where they come from, right? Because in some sense, they're very, very predictable. Now, the book focuses on the Jugalbandi of Atal Bihari Vajpayee and Krishna Advani. All of you intuitively know what a Jugalbandi is, but just to kind of reiterate, a Jugalbandi is a music concert of two people. Key aspects of these two people, they play different, right? It's not a duet. These are musicians, typically soloists, who typically don't play together. They play typically different instruments, different kinds of music. Yet somehow they're able to make music together. The other aspect of a Jugalbandi is nobody is the main performer, nobody is the accompanist. They're both together main performers. And in that sense, it's also not just different music, it's also profoundly an equal music. And that's the metaphor I use for the 60-year relationship between Vajpayee and Advani. To give you just one sense of why this is so important, I know many of you are cricket fans here, but to give you just a contemporary analogy, I thought it was a pretty big deal that Mahendra Singh Dhoni was the captain of Virat Kohli, but later on agreed to serve under Virat Kohli because we Indians, we have big egos. Siddharth is my senior, I'm the junior, and these hierarchies persist for a very long periods of time. So it's very common in government service that if a officer from a junior batch, quote unquote, supersedes someone from the senior batch, the senior will resign, right? That's how hierarchy conscious we are. In contrast, between 1968 and 1986, Vajpayee was the boss of political Hinduism and Advani served under him. And then when the RSS ordered Vajpayee to step down as Bjp president in 1986, Advani became the face and the boss of Hindu nationalism. And from 1986 to 1995, it was Vajpayee who served under him. Once again, from 95 to 2004, Vajpayee was the face. He became prime minister 3 times, and Advani loyally served under him. I haven't found an example of this kind of political switch happening not once but twice anywhere in the political world. I know that in tennis, in cricket, you find some analogies, but in politics, you certainly don't find it. And in some sense, the running theme of this book is teamwork, which is that it's not that Vajpayee and Advani were similar. It's not that they necessarily liked each other all the time, but they managed to work together, just like Modi worked with Advani during that period. And Murli Manohar Joshi, a rival to Advani, Vijayaraje Scindia, as powerful and beloved of the RSS, nonetheless, they managed to work together and they did not split like other political parties. And I end the book with looking at the new Jugalbandi, Amit Shah and Modi, and asking what is similar, what is different. But the heart of what the book focuses on is why the BJP wins. I produce a new argument, namely that it's like an old couple squabbling in the park. They fight a lot, but ultimately they don't divorce. And this ability not to split is so rare. Think about the Congress right now. Even single caste parties like Samajwadi Party, the uncle and the nephew fight. BJP fights all right. They hardly ever split. And that's a very big factor in why they win. Over to you, Manish. I just wanted to give you a little bit of a flavor of what the book is all about. And much more than that, you'll get from what Manish asks. Thank you very much.
Okay, so the most fascinating part of the book, for me at least, was what you highlighted, which was this whole tension between teamwork and individuality. And so, you know, as somebody who's had a co-founder for 25 years, I mean, obviously we want to tear each other apart most days, but you stay together because you believe that you're better off together. So why do you think the BJP, and before that the Jan Sangh, and before that the RSS chose teamwork? Where does this come from?
Well, so I point to, let's just begin with the Vajpayee-Advani relationship. Let's see why that works, and then let's extrapolate it to the movement itself. Now, Vajpayee and Advani were bound by 3 different kinds of Fevicol, right? The first was they liked each other. So think about it, Manish, you know, I'm sure with your co-founder, sometimes you like to get a drink, you know, there are ups and downs, but there is a core chemistry, and that's kind of important, right? No marriage survives unless you have a little bit of a chemistry. That chemistry goes through ups and downs. As for Vajpayee and Advani, it was a 60-year relationship, but that is key. They used to eat pani puri together. They used to watch Bollywood films, right? They used to, cry at the drop of a hat when it came to emotional scenes of Raj Kapoor films. So they had a similar emotional quotient, and that's important, right? The second kind of Fevicol was professional compatibility. Now, Vajpayee and Advani, or Modi and Amit Shah, are not the first Jugalbandi of Hindu nationalism. The first one was Shyama Prasad Mukherjee, who was English speaking, the youngest vice chancellor in the history of Calcutta University. And he was required by the RSS to be the orator of the Jan Sangh, which is the predecessor party of the BJP in parliament. At the same time, they wanted an organizer. So Deen Dayal Upadhyay was deputed to become the first Jugalbandi of Hindu nationalism, because Hindu nationalism is both a movement which seeks to change society as well as a party seeking government. So you need both an orator as well as an organizer. And Vajpayee and Advani fit that role perfectly. Advani was a fantastic organizer. He liked spending time with the cadre. He didn't really like the limelight of press or parliament. The cadre trusted him. He was a man of enormous patience. I point that he could memorize timetables and bus timetables and train timetables, something that Narendra Modi shares with him. And that's why they like each other, because this is Pracharak training. Vajpayee, on the other hand, I don't need to tell this audience, was the most hypnotic political speaker India has produced, right? And at a time when Hindu nationalism was considered outside the mainstream, he played the perfect defense lawyer for the movement in parliament. So that was the second Fevicol, professional compatibility. But the third Fevicol, which is the core argument of the book, is what I call Hindu Fevicol, which is, it's an ideology that valorizes teamwork. It's an ideology, right from a young age, people who go to the RSS are told that, look at Indian history. Indians are constantly invaded because there's infighting, because they're fighting with each other. In the book, I talk about the lesson of the third battle of Panipat, where the Jats and the Marathas and the Rajputs refused to help the Marathas. And within the Marathas itself, there was a lot of infighting. And this history lesson that Indians are weak because they are disunited then becomes an organizational form. So even today, I don't think I'm revealing any secrets to this audience when I say that Modi and Advani don't get along. But recently it was Advani's birthday. Narendra Modi went there, he asked for his blessings. Advani gave blessings. It's complete play acting, but that play acting matters because it's just like any other family. In families, there are tensions between the youngsters and the old. But nonetheless, these protocols are followed. So this is the third bond. And Manish, for me, this is the core argument of the book, that Jugalbandi is the ideology of the BJP itself. It's the ideology of the RSS itself. It's why they don't split. Look, they've split so few times. To give you just one example, in 1995, Shankar Singh Waghela took a lot of MLAs to Khajuraho. Some of you history aficionados will know that. That set in motion a chain of events which ended up with Narendra Modi plucked out of nowhere as the chief minister of Gujarat in 2001. Events like that are so rare that they are used as examples in Hindu nationalism. That's why they win.
So, I mean, you have this wonderful response of Advani when he sees what happens to Narasimha Rao in your earlier book, and he says that, look, we would never do this in our own party.
Yeah.
So do you think that teamwork has gotten stronger or weaker since the migration since 47?
Oh no, I think it's the same. What makes it much more tense today is two things. One is Hindu nationalism has seen political power like never before. So there is natural tension between the government wing and the movement wing, right? Right from 1925, the creation of the RSS, to 1998, they didn't really taste power. Even during the 3-year Janata Party government, the RSS was in the backseat, and Vajpayee was in coalition. So Vajpayee always had the excuse that, look, we can't do what the RSS wants because we're in a coalition. So right now it's being tested, right? The other reason it's being tested is that Narendra Modi is much more of a solitary personality, much more of, there's a cult of personality around Modi, much more than there was around Vajpayee, much more, right? He's much more popular than his party compared to Vajpayee. Yet, contrary to what the doomsdayers have said, he has not broken the RSS, right? People like Vasundhara Raje Scindia and Shivraj Singh Chauhan exist in the BJP today. They were once Modi's competitor to become prime minister. Nonetheless, one of them has been re-elected chief minister of Madhya Pradesh, and Vasundhara Raje still matters in the party. Even today under Modi, the BJP has far more internal democracy than, let's say, the Congress does today, right? So it tells you that the movement is much bigger than the particular personalities of those in power. So teamwork very much still exists. One more example, Manish. When I was doing my book on Narasimha Rao, I interviewed a lot of congressmen. The first thing a congressman does is complain about other congressmen, right? This faction, that faction. In the BJP, the tensions are the same, right? There's the same, we Indians drink the same water, right? Yet, when they used to talk about others in the BJP for this book, there was almost a sense that they were betraying the family. That, in some sense, gave me the clue that maybe that's why they win.
I'm going to come back to this teamwork thing because it's fascinating to me. Why do Indians sometimes suck at teamwork, or why do intellectuals particularly suck at teamwork? But maybe because deafness and blindness is key to making a team work, right? A little bit of deafness and blindness, and that's there in your book as a theme where Vajpayee holds his nose many times, but he doesn't speak up, right? So I think I'll come back to that, but I wanted you to expand on another teamwork I picked up, which was between the RSS and politics, right? I mean, in the early stages, Golwalkar and even sort of Hedgewar later versus Savarkar, right? Savarkar keeps saying, what are you organizing for? Achar banane ke liye organize kar rahe ho? When they refuse to support him, right?
Yeah,
Or even Vajpayee has this relationship with sort of, you are a Sarvgyani, don't go to the RSS, right?
Yes.
So I thought there was another teamwork which kicked in, which was obviously between these two people, but it was between the ideology and politics.
Yes.
And can you expand on how did that teamwork come about, and is it sustainable, and is it from the heart, or is it just opportunistic?
Well, I think it's from the heart, right? Here's what I mean. A lot of people who like the BJP or hate the BJP think that, that every morning Narendra Modi gets a phone call from Mohan Bhagwat, in Nagpur, and then tells him what to do. That's ridiculous, And, many times in the last 100 years, the RSS has not been listened to by the BJP. Famously, between 98 and 2004, nothing that or very little that the RSS wanted was done by the Vajpayee government. They were his number one problem. And the then head of the RSS, K.S. Sudarshan, was very non-Hindu nationalist in that he publicly used to criticize Vajpayee and his family, right? All you have to do is you have the power of the internet. You can search it for yourself. So that relationship has seen a lot of ups and downs. So this idea that the RSS is the mothership that ends up controlling, that just is not true, right? But again, at other points, for example, the Ayodhya movement, it's the RSS who dragged a reluctant Advani and an even more reluctant Vajpayee to finally support the Ayodhya movement almost 4 or 5 years after the Congress did it, right? So there's no golden key to understanding that relationship. You have to look at it, the context, the personalities, and a large part of it, Manish, is that, as I point out in the book, Hindu nationalism doesn't really have a theory of governance. It has a theory of Hinduism. It has a theory of demographics. It has a theory of how to come to power. But if you want to can't read Dattopan Thengdi. On economics alone, the RSS itself has so many different thinkers. To just give you one example, you have Arun Shourie, not from the RSS, who was classically free market. Or you had Yashwant Sinha, Jaswant Singh, again not from the RSS but members of the BJP. You have Dattopan Thengdi, RSS man who founded India's largest trade union. I don't know why nobody writes about him. You have a RSS Hindu nationalist, founding what is considered a bastion of the left, which is a trade union, right? You have Govindacharya, you have, the Swadeshi Jagran Manch that is created. So if you want to understand the economic program of a BJP prime minister, be it Vajpayee or Modi, don't look to Savarkar, don't look to the ideology. And this is the same when it comes to foreign policy, right? And that's one reason why the tension is not as much as a lot of people suspect, because for 80% of what Modi does, Mohan Bhagwat doesn't have a view. Let's say on demonetization, on the China strategy, that's not core to what he does. The core to what he does is to unify Hinduism, to create a Hindu vote bank, so that maybe not in this decade, maybe the next decade, you'll end up with a majority in power. And that is the staying power when it comes to the to the RSS and the BJP. So I think that the combination of these two, which is that there's an ideology that focuses on unity, right? And the fact that the RSS is a little more focused on the social aspect of the project rather than the political project, has made for a roughly smooth relationship. And when it hasn't been smooth, they still haven't divorced. The only exception, as you've read, Manish, is the 1984 elections, when the RSS was so furious with Vajpayee that it ensured that Vajpayee lost because all the RSS votes went for Rajiv Gandhi. I think that would really be the only exception to this.
So can you elaborate, because another theme of this sort of teamwork between ideology and politics was that this is not traditionally, a lot of people think they want it to be undemocratic. I don't think they want to end democracy. They want to use it, right? So I think most people confuse something rare with something new. They think that so can you explain on how they figured this game out, that actually democracy is a game we want to play and we want to win, and we can?
So Manish, as I point out in the beginning of the book, I think we all think that elections came to India only after independence in 1947. It didn't. From the late 19th century itself, the British introduced local elections, limited elections, the big changes for one person, one vote begins in 1909 with the Minto-Morley reforms and really comes into being in the 1920s, right? Now, just take a step back. This is 100 years ago, and imagine how rare this is. Indians live by groups. Our social lives are dictated by groups. Our economic lives are dictated by groups. What gives the fluidity to Indian politics is sometimes we vote as Hindus and Muslims. Sometimes we vote as peasants. Sometimes we vote according to our caste. But nonetheless, we vote as groups, right? And to a group-based society, socially and economically, you suddenly introduce the principle of one person, one vote. You're not going to get Indians who are converted to Swiss voters voting on interest. Instead, groups begin to panic as they begin to realize that for the first time ever in India, the group number or the group size will determine how much power you have. So suddenly, from the question, what is Hinduism, which is what 19th century Hindu thinkers were asking, people like Savarkar begin to ask the question, who is a Hindu, right? That is a demographic question, and it makes no sense except in the context of elections. The Muslim League is created in 1906, 1905, 1906, precisely because the rich Muslim zamindars of the United Provinces, what is today UP, were terrified that the British were introducing elections, because suddenly Muslims would be reduced to 25% of the vote share, which is what they were pre-partition, right? They would be reduced to the status of a minority. Even the word minority and majority only matters in the context of elections, right? So from the beginning itself, the Muslim League was pushing against one person, one vote, separate electorates for Muslims, parity between, one Muslim voter and 3 Hindu voters. And this is what leads to partition, right? In some sense. On the other hand, early Hindu nationalists like Lala Lajpat Rai were thrilled with one person, one vote, saying that, look, Hindus are a majority here, right? We love one person, one vote. But what we have to ensure is that Hindus begin to vote as Hindus. That is the 100-year project of Hindu nationalism. They are constituted and created by the desire for a Hindu vote bank, which only makes sense under conditions of elections. Now, it is entirely fair to say that the BJP is not liberal being defined as they don't focus on individual rights. But look, which party in India focuses on individual rights? So in that sense, most voters ask the question, look, everybody is trying to redefine groups. Everybody is playing vote bank politics. BJP is also playing vote bank politics in that sense. So in that sense, there seems to be something very Indian about the BJP's response to elections. And a lot of people call the BJP fascist. Is absolutely untrue, or that there's some Hindu Rashtra that lies ahead. It doesn't lie ahead. This is what Hindu Rashtra looks like, which is a Hindu national community operating under a constitutional democracy. So in that sense, this claim that somehow they're fascist, somehow Modi will end elections. Why will he end elections? He's just won the Hyderabad municipal elections. He's just won Bihar. These are people who are constituted by elections, who morning to evening are wondering about which is the next election to win. This is what democracy looks like in a group-based society. And what the BJP is doing today, what Narendra Modi is doing today, is just the 100-year consequence of that initial spark of elections in India.
The vote bank politics is a question which I also had, that, imagine communities, or, Maya Angelou used to say the universe isn't made of atoms, it's made of stories. But Hinduism, as you point out, doesn't have a book like the Quran, nor does it have this authority like the Vatican. So the deep horizontal comradeship is not natural, as you say. So how did this 100-year project anchor on? Was it good storytelling? Was it teamwork? Was it timing? Was it just skill in politics? What do you think has created this horizontal, which is even in your own words is not natural?
Yeah. And Manish, just to be clear, I'm not saying Hinduism didn't exist before the 20th century. Hinduism is age-old. The idea of Hinduism has a strong idea of religious territory, which is at least from the 4th century AD, the Vishnu Purana, right? But what Hinduism has always lacked is a sense of fellow feeling. You are Hindu, I am Hindu, right? And therefore, let's vote for the same party. Let's fight against the same enemy. This is what the RSS has seen as the problem. How have they gone about creating this vote? I think that two things. One is that compared to traditional Hinduism, the RSS and the BJP are much more progressive. So traditional Hinduism would have had contempt for someone like Narendra Modi, who is a tea seller's son, who belongs to a Ghanchi oil presser caste in Gujarat. Whereas, Hindu nationalism allows him social mobility, right? Gives him dignity. And, lots of critics of the BJP, keep portraying it as an upper caste party. Look, it knows, the BJP and the RSS know that if they are only an upper caste party, it will get 20% of the vote. For 100 years, they have been trying to reach out to OBCs, to tribals, to Dalits. And in the 2019 elections, almost 100 years after that effort began, more Dalits, more OBCs, and more tribals have voted for the BJP, for Modi, than they voted for anyone else, right? So you have to confront this fact. At the same time, if it's a certain progressive reach out to lower castes that have defined the BJP in all these decades, I must say, and I don't have an axe to grind, that the targeting of Muslims as the other is the other way in which they've done it. And in this way, they're also different from traditional Hinduism, because traditional Hinduism has always had respect for other religions. So there's this apocryphal story. It's an apocryphal story. I haven't been able to find the footnote of Arab Muslims from Arabia coming to Kerala soon after the lifetime of Prophet Muhammad, and the local Hindus build them a mosque there, right? That's the Hindu way. Whereas, the way of Hindu nationalism is to also create laws against love jihad. As a result, Manish, today, you have for the first time an OBC prime minister and a Dalit president, all under the reign of the BJP. And you have laws against love jihad, also under the reign of the BJP. That's why they're able to create this vote bank.
So, walk me through the difference. I mean, there's obviously a wonderful chapter on the temple demolition, which you call too many generals. So can you explain what you mean by that? What was because everybody sort of believes that this was you don't seem to believe that this was almost, you almost think it was sort of went out of control, is your impression?
Yeah, I think it went out of control. Look, unlike the trial court, to be very clear, I think there was a conspiracy, right? It's not that nobody did it. The question is who all were in on the conspiracy, and specifically, was Vajpayee and Advani, did they know of this conspiracy? That's the question I asked. Now, I spent a lot of time on this question. I had a whole chapter in my Narasimha Rao book where I looked at the events leading up to December 6th from the eyes of Narasimha Rao, and he had all the papers, government documents, etc., etc. I did a ton of interviews. And for this book, I have a whole chapter on that looks at the demolition of Babri Masjid from the eyes of Vajpayee and Advani, right? And just to make it clear here that all I'm saying is that on the day of December 6th, right, it seemed as if things were out of control, or to put it differently, Advani and Vajpayee were not in charge anymore, right? I provide detailed evidence for it on the day itself. But I also point out that ever since the Ayodhya movement began in 1983 by the RSS and the VHP, right, the BJP kept a distance, Vajpayee and Advani kept a distance. There were actually two congressmen on stage at the creation of the Ayodhya movement, and Rajiv Gandhi supported the Ayodhya movement about 4 years before the BJP supported it. So in some sense, Advani's Rath Yatra in 1990 was not a signal to India as much as a signal to his own party that, look, I'm with you, right? As well as the need to unify Hindu votes that were being splintered because of the Mandal Commission report that had been implemented just the previous month. So I give you a narrative of, Vajpayee and Advani, who seem to be, certainly Advani, riding a tiger which he can't climb down from, right? And if you buy that narrative and you look at the kind of evidence, it does seem a little bit like things have gone out of control. Now, in no way am I kind of giving a clean chit to the BJP, because the argument I make in the book is, look, the BJP's demand to demolish or Hindu nationalism's demand to demolish the Babri Masjid begins in 1983. So why are you so obsessed with December 6, 1992? Move 9 years prior. And in June 1991, a BJP chief minister, a BJP man becomes chief minister of Uttar Pradesh, which is Kalyan Singh. Kalyan Singh is a part of the movement to demolish the mosque already. So what should Narasimha Rao do, right? Or what should the Indian constitution do? That here's a man who has vowed to demolish the temple. He is popularly elected as chief minister. Should he be removed? Should the BJP be made to sign an affidavit saying that unless you renounce the Ayodhya movement, we will not give you power, even though so many people are voting for you? The deeper question which the Ayodhya movement symbolizes, which nobody wants to look in the eye, is that there is a clash of the Nehruvian principle of secularism enshrined in the constitution, as well as the principle of democracy enshrined in the constitution. How are you going to resolve that? Of a repeated forensic analysis of the minutes, beginning at 12:20 noon on December 6th will never help us solve that. That is the larger question facing the republic, that do we need a new definition of secularism? Because certainly the Nehruvian idea of secularism has been democratically changed in India. The BJP is a deep product of democracy. To me, that's the larger question, Manish, not so much the specifics on December 6, 92.
Okay, so let me switch a little bit. That you have a wonderful line in there that the Americans were surprised by the nuclear blast or the Mandir or Article 370 because they only read secret documents, right?
Yes.
They don't read manifestos since the 1950 of the party.
Yes.
Now, So if these three were projects, and Article 370 is particularly interesting to me. I was born and brought up in Kashmir,
Right.
but you have this interesting contrast to say that Vajpayee and Advani had a very different view of Pakistan and Kashmir than Modi and Amit Shah.
Yeah.
So can you elaborate on that a little bit, on what is the difference in the views when actually the manifesto has been constant since the 50s?
Yeah. So look, on Article 370, deep down, Vajpayee and Advani would have supported it, would have supported the removal of 370, or did support the removal of 370. Look, this is a demand of the Jansangh, then BJP, all the way from the 1950s. So in that sense, why is everybody surprised that when the BJP has a majority under Modi and Amit Shah, this is what they'll do? They've been saying they'll do this for like 70 years. The only reason Vajpayee was unable to do it, and he was very open about it, saying that, look, we don't have a majority and our coalition partners won't stand for it. So on the question of Article 370, I would say there's no difference between the new and old Jugalbandi. Where there is a difference when it comes to reaching out to Kashmiris and reaching out to Pakistan. You know, I argue in the book, I have a whole chapter, Oh Pakistan, that Vajpayee was the most, or I don't want to say pro-Pakistan prime minister because that's liable for misinterpretation in these days, but he did the most to reach out to Pakistan. He made so many efforts for peace in Pakistan that no prime minister before or after him has even come close. And you see it today. Today, even in Pakistan or in Kashmir, there's a lot of fondness for Vajpayee, right? Again, I want to be very careful about my sentence construction. I'm not saying he's pro-Pakistan, but he made the effort to settle the Kashmir issue, to settle the tensions with Pakistan more than any other prime minister. Second, Advani supported him 100%. And this is even more of a puzzle because Advani was a rich English-speaking Macaulay Putra who was dispossessed because of partition. The two-nation theory destroyed his family, uprooted him, pushed him into Hindu nationalism. If there's anyone who is entitled to a feeling of revenge, it should be Advani. But Advani supported Vajpayee 100%. That's point number 2. Point number 3, they failed. And they did the Lahore Bus Yatra, they failed. Agra Summit failed. Back channel diplomacy failed. Reach out to Kashmir failed. Reach out to the Hurriyat failed. Why did that happen, right? And so, despite reaching out, he failed. And I have an Amit Shah quote there saying that, in the end of the chapter, saying that, look, there's only one solution to the Kashmir issue, that India is strong and Pakistan is weak. And look, I think there's something to that because Kashmir is integral to the Pakistan's idea of the two-nation theory. Like, if they don't think that a contiguous Muslim majority state should be part of Pakistan, then what makes the idea of Pakistan doesn't make any sense. Even more than East Bengal, it's Kashmir that falls into the two-nation theory, and equally for the BJP, the idea of, or any Indian party, the two-nation theory is wrong, because if the two-nation theory is right, what happens to the 13% Muslims in India, right? So there can never be convergence between the Pakistani and the Indian view on Kashmir. And this is not a pleasant thing to say, but I think that nobody did more for peace with Pakistan than Vajpayee. And the fact that even he failed should be a warning sign for us.
Okay. So let me, there are lots of questions piling up, so I'll figure out that. But in the final analysis, we've often discussed this in areas context, that 90% complete is incomplete, Yeah. And so did they brought the project a substantial distance, but they didn't close the deal, right? They didn't get re-elected, this Jugalbandi. And the next Jugalbandi came in, right? And this Jugalbandi was right, but they weren't successful.
Yes.
Being successful is more important than being right.
Yeah.
So what was the difference? Was it killer instinct? Was it hard work? Was it skill? Was it aggression? Or was it just better teamwork in your mind, since you have thought of that a little bit, you've reflected on it, and you would agree that the project was incomplete at the end of that Jugalbandi?
Well, I think there are two reasons for that, Manish. I agree with you. One is, I think Modi is a better mass politician than Vajpayee or Advani. Now, keep in mind that Advani was a backroom organizer, right? Except for a brief period during the Rath Yatra, he's not a man who could win a state. Neither could Vajpayee. Vajpayee could, mobilize parliament, mobilize opposition leaders. And after the 1996 famous no confidence motion speech, he became everybody's favorite granduncle, right? But nonetheless, neither Vajpayee nor Advani could win a state the way, say, Vijay Raje Scindia could for the Jansangh and BJP. the way Bhairo Singh Shekhawat could Rajasthan. So I think Modi is much better mass politician, and in that sense, he has a feel for the pulse of people better than Vajpayee and Advani. And in that sense, the prime minister he's most like is Indira Gandhi. So I think that's one reason. But a deeper reason, which is more favorable to Vajpayee and Advani, is they were battling greater odds. They were operating in a much more hostile context. Now, those of you who are older and listening to this, remember a period in which the Nehruvian idea of India dominated India. Even the opposition parties agreed with Nehru. They just may not agree with the personality of Nehru, but Nehruism, right, which is a suspicion of the Hindu majority religion taking over the state, a belief that the state must control society and the economy, and a belief that non-elected institutions should be treated by respect. I think these are the three pillars of the Nehruvian consensus, were shared by even Jayaprakash Narayan, right? For Vajpayee and Advani to operate, they had to be part of that consensus. They were untouchable, right? The second big drawback that Vajpayee and Advani faced was, as I point out, the murder of Mahatma Gandhi, who, as Jinnah pointed out when Gandhi died, was the leader of India's Hindus. And the suspicion that the Hindu nationalist ideology was involved in the murder. I make it clear here that RSS as an institution was not involved, but I also point out that the RSS shared Godse's criticisms of Gandhi. I mean, they didn't want to do anything violent about it, but the taint that the RSS and Hindu nationalism had because of the Mahatma's murder took them 40, 50 years to go away, right? Had that not happened, Hindu nationalism would have come to power much earlier. And so for these two reasons, the over dominance of the Nehruvian consensus in parliament all the way up till 91, right? And the taint from the murder of Mahatma Gandhi meant that Vajpayee and Advani always had to bat on back foot, always, Modi and Advani have, Modi and Amit Shah have this kind of mandate, this kind of skills, and a very different Indian voter. They can hit sixes, they can play on front foot. So definitely, I think, Manish, to just end up answering your question, the context is much more favorable to Modi and Amit Shah, and that's because they are building on what Vajpayee and Advani have been able to achieve so far.
Okay. So I'll get to questions if people keep adding them. We've got 3 or 4. I don't want to start questions till we have a few more. But you have a wonderful line by Deen Dayal Upadhyay where he says the task of taking the Ganga back to its previous position may not be wise. Can you, and in your book, Deen Dayal Upadhyay comes across as a really important, smart, institutional kind of guy, right? Can you elaborate on his personality and his role a little bit? Because everybody sort of is seeing a lot of schemes named after him, but they think that they're wondering who the hell is this guy and why are they? And as it is, people believe sort of, and he was quite there is a belief that the party is anti-intellectual. They don't like prima donnas and there's stuff like that. So just bring Deen Dayal Upadhyay a little bit, because this is profound.
Deen Dayal Upadhyay is not an original thinker. He's not an intellectual. As I point out, I don't like to use the word plagiarize, but the ideology that is most associated with him, which is integral humanism, the ideas, even the word has come from a Christian democratic thinker in the 1930s, right? But that would be missing the greatness of Deen Dayal Upadhyay. He was an organizational man par excellence. I think we Indians spend too much time celebrating intellectuals without valorizing people who get it done, right? And Deen Dayal Upadhyay was an organizer. He knew how to get it done. He knew how to massage egos from people to work in a team. He was a great talent spotter. Soon after Shyama Prasad Mukherjee's death, he realizes that Hindu nationalism needs an orator. So finds Vajpayee, who is Shyama Prasad's translator, gives him a Lok Sabha ticket, and that begins Vajpayee's career, right? Simultaneously, he's able to see that Advani is an excellent organizer, so also nurtures his career. So there are many people, like even Murli Manohar Joshi, who we hear about today, who are spotted by Deen Dayal Upadhyay. And so I think he's deservedly lionized within Hindu nationalism. He was also a remarkably austere man. He was not driven by self-interest. I have a story there from the mid-1960s when Deen Dayal Upadhyay somebody sees Deen Dayal Upadhyay basically waving a wet kurta in the wind. And that person goes to Deen Dayal and said, "What are you doing?" And Deen Dayal says, "Look, I have only 2 kurtas and I spilled coffee on this one. So I'm washing it because if I don't wash it, what will I wear tomorrow?" Right? This is remarkable. This is a man, who is the all powerful in the party after Shyama Prasad Mukherjee's death. in the early 1950s, all the way to 1968, when Deen Dayal Upadhyay is murdered. There's a lot of that in the book. He is the unquestioned king of Hindu nationalism. And, when he dies, I have a quote from Golwalkar who says, and let me say it in English, "Oh God, if you wanted to take him away from us, why did you give him to us to begin with?" Right? So he is an absolutely remarkable figure. Manish, also the quote that you attribute to him is very important, right? Because this lot of critics of the BJP and of Hindu nationalism imagine that they want to take us back to some Vedic past. Not at all. The core argument of this book is they are modern. They are driven by modern electoral demands. Insofar as they have views on traditional Hinduism, they are critical of it in many ways. They think of traditional Hinduism as a source of weakness in some sense. So they are a reformist movement. And if you are a scheduled caste, an OBC, or a tribal, you would see the institutions of Hindu nationalism as far more progressive than you would see the institutions of traditional Hinduism. So in that sense, the quote that you've picked is I think, exactly right, because the point of BJP is not to turn back the Ganga to the past. It's to grapple with the problems of the present.
Let's turn to some questions. So do you think that the cadre-based grassroots organization, Prernatandan asked, is the strength of the BJP party, which is the cadre-based organization? Often I've thought that, the BJP, the Congress has a good lateral entry program, but a bad management trainee program.
Yeah,
and the BJP has a good management trainee program, but a bad lateral entry program.
Yeah.
So I guess that's her sort of question here. Is that the source of why they win, that grassroots organization?
Well, let me add or push back against that a little bit, Manish, because you're right? Which is that, Congress is good at lateral entry. The other way of the impolite way of lateral entry is ayaram, gayaram, right? That's what we call, when the good tiding is good, people come to you. When the tidings are bad, they leave. And it has a terrible cadre system, terrible management system. But here's the thing. Every political party realizes it needs a cadre. So it's not, this insight is that a cadre is required to win elections. The insight is not new to the BJP, right? So the Congress actually has an RSS equivalent organization called the Seva Dal. It's a joke. It's an absolute joke, right? The Bahujan Samaj Party had something like the RSS, had a cadre system called the Bahujan Volunteer Force. It's a shadow of its former self, right? The communists are also a cadre system, right? They hardly win anywhere in India. So the existence of a cadre alone doesn't preclude its effectiveness. What the BJP has is that the cadre stay united. That, when a senior leader leaves, a lateral entry somewhere else, he or she doesn't take 30 cadre, 30 people of the cadre with the Congress. Unfortunately, is engineered as not cadres loyal to individual leaders, right? Who come and go alongside the individual leaders. So the deeper question for me when it came to cadre is, why is it that the cadre in the BJP are united? Why is it that they are loyal? Why is it that they stay together, right? Because the communists have it too, but that doesn't prevent the communists from splitting from CPI to CPIM, right? And from CPIM to CPIML. And this entire fight between underground and overground, which has ruined the communists. Again, I'm just being descriptive. Some of you may like the communists, may not. But the communists are a very powerful force in Bihar, as the recent election showed, and they've been there for a long time. But one of the reasons that they've had a lot of problems is that the cadre has been split into the Naxalites, right, who believe in waging war against the state, and the mainstream communists who basically want compromises with bourgeois democracy, right? So the question is not that, the secret sauce is the cadre. The question for the BJP is, because everyone has cadre and everybody knows cadre is important. The question is, why does this cadre stay coherent and united? And that is my book answers that with this idea of Hindu Fevicol, right?
So there's a sort of follow-up on that is, why is the idea of a cohesive Hindu vote bank been successful in electoral dividends in the north and west of India? And why do you think it's not been as successful in the south of India?
I think that's a very good question, right? And especially in the period that I am writing about, which ends in 2004, it's basically a northern and western Indian party. Whereas Narendra Modi has now sort of expanded, to Hyderabad, to Telangana, Karnataka, a little bit even before him. And of course, in the east of India. Definitely the critics are right that the original the original DNA of the, or let's put it this way, the original heir of Hindu nationalism is an upper caste North Indian party, right? Hindi Hindu, right? That has been, but every single party in India begins with a social base. The BJP's organizational geniuses has been able to transcend it. So just like it has over time translated its caste limitations, we are seeing now under Modi that it's going beyond its geographic limitations that the questioner talked about. And I suspect that in the next 10 years, people will stop asking the question that you asked, right? And you look at a different question. But that is a very good question. That is very, very good. But it just tells you that there's nothing natural about the BJP's majority identity. It's not. You have to work at it. You have to create an organization. You have to move. It tells you that this idea that, look, India is a Hindu majority country. Of course, you'll have a Hindu party. The fact that it has geographical and initially caste limitations itself goes against that natural assumption, right?
So this is a big question if you want, but you should maybe take a stab at it. Why is the Congress a one family party and the BJP a tag team party? I mean, why does the BJP have Jugalbandi and the Congress doesn't?
Well, I'm happy to. And I think one of the reasons is that I don't think that the Congress is a uniquely dynastic party. The Congress is an Indian party and Indians are nepotists, right? So Manish, you're a first generation entrepreneur in the business world. But, I think you feel lonely sometimes. Look around you. You will find, even at your level, many people who are there because they're sons and daughters of the famous and the rich, right? So it's not this idea that only the Congress is nepotistic. Firstly, that's not true in Indian politics itself, right? The Samajwadi Party is nepotistic. There's a third generation dynast in the Shiv Sena. The DMK is a nepotistic party. So Indians think we are a group-based society where parents like to favor the children, right? You go and meet a doctor, chances are that doctor's parents was a doctor. I am a lawyer by training, and I think, Siddharth can attest to that the number of judges, the number of lawyers you'll find whose main qualification or main asset is that they have parental backing, right? They have parents of lawyers. Now, of course, you may be talented, you may not be talented. Indira Gandhi was a nepotist. She was a supremely talented, or a dynast. She was a supremely talented politician. Rahul Gandhi is a dynast. He's a very bad politician. So the merit argument is a bit different. So in that sense, the Congress is only representing India. And it took me a long time to see this, that when we complain about the Congress, the problem is actually too traditional an Indian party, right? All the problems of India, you name it, you can see it represented in the Congress party. The BJP is a radical party, right? It understands the problems of India. It understands the bane of teamwork in India. So to give you just one example, why do you think Golwalkar, the second and most influential pracharak, the head of, Sarsang Chalak of the RSS, had a rule that the pracharaks, who are the frontline functionaries of the RSS, should not be married? Because he said, once you're married, you'll have children, right? Then you say the children should also join the RSS. If the children join the RSS, someone like Narendra Modi, talented but from a low caste, poor background, why will he join the RSS? Because he'll say, look, there's a glass ceiling. That's the reason nobody wants to join the Congress, right? And one example which I point out in the book tells you how powerful this radical idea of the BJP and RSS is, which is to go against traditional Indian family norms, is that there were only two senior RSS functionaries who reached the very top or almost the top of the RSS while being married. One is a gentleman called Madhukar Rao Bhagwat, who told Golwalkar that, look, my mother is very old. Please let me get married so that my wife can take care of my mother. And Golwalkar his heart melted and he said yes. And the other is a gentleman called M.G. Vaidya, who I interviewed, who was already married when the rule came to effect, I think sometime in the 40s or 50s, right? I think sometime in the 50s. Today, their children are the number 1 and number 3 in the RSS, right? Think about that. Literally in the 100-year history of the RSS, there may be one or two more, but the two most prominent exceptions of senior RSS functionaries having children, right, are Madhukar Rao Bhagwat and M.G. Vaidya. Today, their children are the number 1 and number 3. They will never perpetuate the dynasty because they don't have children. They are not married, right? That exception tells you that why such a rule is so important, because you literally open the door just slightly and you end up with dynasty and nepotism, right? So to answer your question, Manish, I think the difference is that the BJP is a radical organization which wants to break from what it sees are the mistakes of the Indian past. The Congress, ironically, is a very Indian political party.
There's another question which I'd love to get your take. Why aren't Modi and Shah as good communicators as Vajpayee and Advani? I'm not sure that's even true, but I'd love to hear your take because I mean, we have to measure communication by winning elections, right?
Yeah.
Or we can judge them by other standards.
Yeah. Well, look, I don't think Advani was a very good communicator, famously, right? And Advani, as I, when I do these books like this, I always, have to say one or two defining characteristics of the people I write about. Advani's defining characteristic was underconfidence. He was constantly plagued by self-doubt. And I do think I trace that to somewhat to the devastating trauma of partition, right? A man loses his confidence, is reduced to near penury. And then, of course, he finds Atal Bihari Vajpayee, who is a charismatic superstar, right? Absolute superstar. So I think it's a bit unfair to compare Modi and Amit Shah to Vajpayee because Vajpayee is a 1 in 100 years person. Nobody comes close because look, when he communicates, Manish, he could make you laugh, he could make you cry, he could bring out a range of different emotions, right? He could sweep you off your feet even if you are an enemy or an opponent. And that was one skill of his. The other skill he has is that he could say the same sentence that you as a left or someone as a left-wing person would take to mean, oh, Vajpayee agrees with me. Whereas the RSS would hear it and say, yeah, Vajpayee is saying nothing wrong, right? To give you just one example of this, and look, Modi, Amit Shah can't come close because no Indian politician can come close, right? And in that sense, I'm very grateful that I didn't meet Vajpayee because had I met Vajpayee, I wouldn't have been objective in writing this book. It's like meeting, once you meet Frank Sinatra, how can you write a book on him that is objective, right? So it's, or once you hear Frank Sinatra, you're already biased, right? But just to give you one example of Vajpayee's remarkable ability, he, as all many of your viewers know, he goes to Pakistan in the late 90s on the Lahore bus yatra. He goes to Pakistan and really big deal. And he addresses a gathering of the glitterati of Pakistan. And there he begins by saying that, look, back home, some people are saying, and I'm saying it in English, he says it in Hindi, that by coming to Pakistan, I have put a mohar or a stamp on Pakistan's legitimacy, right? And then he pauses, the famous Vajpayee pause, where listeners don't know where he's going to go, right? And then he says, I'm here to tell you that Pakistan does not need a seal or a mohar from anybody, right? That's it. That's the sentence, right? But everyone in Pakistan knows what he means because what he's saying is that, look, I know I'm come from Hindu nationalism, but I don't believe in an Akhand Bharat. I believe in where I disagree with you is on Kashmir, but I believe that Pakistan is a nation state. It's done. It's finished. There's no chance of changing that, right? That's what he's telling the Pakistanis. But had he said it in the way I'm saying it, the RSS would have completely protested back home. So he said in this kind of elliptical way and the RSS didn't protest back home, right? Nobody can speak like that, Manish. And for a movement that is kind of making it, where the cadre are on one page, where the Hindu majority is on another page, where opposition is on another page, you need somebody who could speak in multiple registers. So to end to that question, I think it's a little unfair to compare anyone, including Modi, Amit Shah, and certainly Advani, to Vajpayee's raw speaking charisma.
So stay on Vajpayee because that Pakistan quote I also noticed. He tried with Musharraf, he tried with Sharif.
Yes.
Both were how he went from through Kargil. I mean, just elaborate on that period because that why did he do that? Kargil was not a thorn in the flesh. It was a dagger in the heart, right?
No. So first is that, I think it's very important if you have to understand Hindu nationalism, you have to see partition from the way they see it, right? Now, some critics have argued that actually Hindu nationalists welcome partition because by doing that, the Muslim percentage in India moved from 25% to 13%, right? The biggest losers of partition have been Indian Muslims, right? From a confident minority, they have been their population has been reduced hugely, and they are wholly dependent on the Congress party. But what's astonishing is that no Hindu nationalists supported partition because for them, partition wasn't the partition of people, it was partition of sacred land. And this is an aspect of Hinduism that is embedded into the DNA of traditional Hinduism, which is the idea of the snowy mountains on the top, the oceans below, the Sindhu River. It's very, very important for Hindu nationalism. It's even though they're a modern movement, this is one aspect of their beliefs that links back to traditional Hinduism, right? And partition was a catastrophe. Partition was also a catastrophe because right from the 1920s, Savarkar and the RSS are complaining that in appeasing the Muslim League, Gandhi has got it exactly wrong. So Gandhi's sort of argument was that by giving concessions to the Muslim League, he was pushing for Hindu-Muslim unity against the British. But what Savarkar would argue, what the RSS argued, and what even Ambedkar argued was, by doing that, you're making partition inevitable. You're making a civil war inevitable, and that's exactly what happened, right? So in that sense, for them, partition. And the argument that the same mentality that the Congress had when it came to getting the Muslim League wrong in the lead up to partition is the same mentality that Nehru displayed when it came to Kashmir and Article 370. Again, it's not my job here, and just to be clear, my book is not a pro or an anti-BJP book at all. And as evidence, I've got center-right magazines, center-right newspapers, and left-wing newspapers both to like the book, right? Because that's for you. That's not my job, right? But I'm just giving you a descriptive analysis. So given this background, Manish, you have to see how partition plays it's like a ghost that is haunting the BJP. And I think Vajpayee realizes finally that unless he finishes the Kashmir issue, finishes the Pakistan issue, BJP will never mainstream itself in parliament, right? It will never get out of what its critics allege, its limitations, etc., etc. So for him, it was a final act of mainstreaming the BJP, which is what he had devoted his entire life to do. For Advani, in fact, it's even more ironical because, as I pointed out, I mean, he had suffered the most because of partition, but he was very rational about it. He told the British High Commissioner, and I quote that look, just like it takes a Nixon or a right-wing president to bring peace with China, right, in the US, only the BJP could bring peace with Pakistan. And, I say in that sense, what Advani did is even more creditable because his suffering that because of the idea of Pakistan had been infinitely greater when it came to Vajpayee.
So you've written a Narasimha Rao biography and this. So do people make history or does history make people? I mean, is that was this inevitable? What happened? What Narasimha Rao did? Was he created by circumstances? Were these two, this Jugalbandi and the next Jugalbandi, or is it the universe doesn't move on its own and somebody has to get up and push it every morning, right? What is what is your view of the world?
People make history, right? And it's not firstly, in the Narasimha Rao book, I pushed back against this argument that liberalization was inevitable. I say it wasn't, right? In this book, I pushed back against the argument that in a Hindu majority country, the rise of the BJP was inevitable because it wasn't. And I show you that, look, India is a peasant and worker majority country. Why didn't the communists coming to power, right? India is a majority non-upper caste Bahujan country. Why didn't Kashiram become prime minister? So you need a lot more than just the tides of history. Now, sometimes it's people, sometimes it's changes in demographics, sometimes it's events. So to give you an example, the emergency played a huge role in socializing Hindu nationalism into respecting civil liberties because they realized if we have the power to put somebody in jail, well, they can put us in jail too. And note, I'm talking about the BJP of that period, right? Because my book ends in 2004. So that's one thing I push back against this really, in some sense, is lazy view that once something happens, next morning, it's like, talking about a cricket match the morning after that. Yeah, he should have hit 100 after he hits 100. It doesn't work like that. But it's not just people, it's events. There are structural changes. There are demographic changes. All of these matter hugely, right? But the deeper point I think you're pushing me to answer is that, the reason to read a book like this, or specifically to read this book, is don't just think that if you read Savarkar, you'll understand the BJP today, right? The journey has shaped the destination. That journey consists of people. It consists of structural changes. It consists of events. That's the only way to understand this. And there, I think my training as a political scientist, Manish, helps because I'm interested in causation, right? I'm interested in why did the BJP rise, right? And if there are a bunch of factors, I keep telling my students that, look, an answer to a puzzle can't be like a Gujarati thali that everything is also, everything is simultaneously true. Some things are true and something aren't, right? And I think that is our job as academics.
Absolutely. So, I think that the book is remarkable. I mean, I'm going to hold it up because you absolutely have to get hold
Thank
of
you
it
very
to
much,
read it.
Manish. Thank
And,
you.
there's a wonderful line in there, and there are two of them which involve Vajpayee, where Nehru introduces Vajpayee to Khrushchev and says, this is a future prime minister. And Khrushchev says, well, what is he doing here? We
Yeah.
send people like him to the gulag in our country.
Yeah.
But, many years later, when Vajpayee reacts to the Supreme Court judgment, a shameful Supreme Court judgment about the emergency, but he's very calm and he says political battles can't be fought by legal means. And I think that those two worldviews of India, right, that India, the future prime minister was, he did become prime minister, but his worldview was that, courts don't substitute for elections, even though that's where he came from. But in your closing, if you wanted to sort of just leave us with what was your basic learning in contrasting writing the Simha Rao biography and this biography? Was it contrasting the Congress party and the BJP, or was it contrasting the individuals?
No, I think one is definitely contrasting the Congress party and the BJP and their internal cultures and just the way, they talk about each other, just that. That matters, that you may not like each other, but treat your colleagues in your own party with some amount of respect, But I think that the point that you alluded to, which is that, when it comes to the emergency, Vajpayee says that, look, you can't, the solution is not the law, it's politics. I think that's the deeper lesson in some sense. So I'm glad you asked this as the last question that I realized out of the book, because for Hindu nationalism, India is not constituted in 1947. The constitution doesn't constitute India. In that sense, it's a fundamentally different view from the Congress worldview, right? Or the worldview of most liberals. There's a fantastic book by Madhav Khosla out recently on the Indian constitution, where he says that whether it was Nehru or Ambedkar, their idea of building the constitution was a self-consciously elite project, because they bought into the British idea that Indians were incapable of modern secular democracy. And yet, how do you then bring modern secular democracy to a society that just doesn't have this tradition, right? It's a hierarchical society, etc., etc. That was the British view of Indian society. And the answer was to create a constitution that actually teaches and educates Indians and transforms them, right? And I realize now that that idea has failed. I think we may disagree about whether it was a good idea or bad idea to begin with, but I think this idea that the Indian constitution has transformed Indians is ridiculous. It just hasn't worked. To give you just one example, the Indian constitution talks about secularism, etc., etc. But we don't even have a non-English word for secularism in India. So they say Sarv Dharm Nirpeksh, but that's not really it. That tells you how bad this English-speaking idea of transforming India has failed, 70 long years after that. In that sense, you may not agree with the BJP, RSS, the book is not pro them, but their idea that you have to go at something deeper, that you look to society, not just the state, right? And it's something that my own inclination, I am an English speaking type, Macaulay Putra, as the RSS would like to say. I have a law background and lawyers are obsessed about the state, laws, institutions. But I think doing this book has taught me that even after 70 years, how shallow or how superficial all that we call the law is when it comes to Indian society, right? And therefore, if you're really interested in India, look beyond the constitution, look beyond the state into how society actually operates at the local level. And come to any conclusion. I'm not saying pick the BJP's conclusion, but I think that's the big learning that has come after 3 years working on this book. Look at Indian society, not just Indian state.
Wonderful. It's a book about statecraft. It's a book about political entrepreneurship, the pursuit of power. And I think, just sheer courage of conviction on a part of a lot of people who come together. So anybody who wants to think about leadership or think about teams, think about politics should really read the book. It's a wonderful book, Vinay. Many congratulations on writing it. And thank you for writing it. And thank you for spending the evening with us today.
Thank you very much, Manish. A real pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Manish, for that conversation. And
well, by the way, I just want to interrupt. The fact that even though Siddharth is my senior and I'm the junior, but he doesn't treat me like that means that he's learned some of the core arguments of the book. Yeah.
Okay,
Absolutely.
I don't have an immediate repartee to that. Maybe when I meet you in person next to the BIC, we can settle scores on that. But thanks so much, Vinay, and thank you so much once again for giving us a quick overview. Well, 1 hour of very interesting conversation on the book. I've just started reading it myself. In true lawyer form, I've already started marking up some things, so I will have a conversation with you. And thanks again, Manish, for chaperoning this program through. And thank you, each one of you, for listening in. Good evening and goodbye.
Good night.